Now let's go to developing news from within this past hour from police in Ferguson, Missouri, following the deadly shooting of a teenager by police. 18-year-old Michael Brown was shot dead by police Saturday afternoon, 2 days before he was reportedly set to begin his first day of college.
Trymaine, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
What's going on in your location now?
The line of police officers started marching forward. They started launching off cannons. I'm not sure if you can hear in the background the booms and explosions. There's nothing but smoke in the air. People are running back. They're marching on. The people were staying in the street. It's nothing but can't see anything in the street. Stun grenades and tear gas. The entire is starting to burn now. The entire street is filled with smoke. I can't see 20 yards ahead of me.
That's what we're covering. Gentleman behind me in the mask is telling me that this is a civil rights movement. It's just not about Mike Brown. It's about all people. There's a lot of frustration.
It has been 5 years since African-American teenager Michael Brown was shot to death by a white police officer in Ferguson, Missouri, a killing that prompted thousands to take to the streets and demand equality and justice. These protests lasted for months and highlighted for all the world to see the deep-rooted problems with race relations in this country. So as we look back on that day and the months of anger that followed, the question is, what has changed in the last 5 years? And what still needs to be done? Joining me now, MSNBC correspondent Trymaine Lee, who was in that video that we just showed. He reported on the ground in Ferguson for weeks, sometimes in very dangerous situations. And Jason Johnston back with me. Trymaine, 5 years. You were on the ground there, sometimes choking on tear gas. What goes through your mind as you look back on the last 5 years?
You know, Stephanie, where do we begin? When I think back to that August day, it was so hot. You know, it's August in St. Louis, but more so the emotions were running even hotter. And to think that this was sparked not just by this long history of alleged police abuses in that community, but Michael Brown's body laying out, baking in the sun for 4 hours, drawing people out of their homes. It was really the neighborhood that sparked this movement. And it truly was a movement that spread not only from St. Louis and Missouri, but across the country. And I remember the pain in the people's faces. There was so much excitement from young people who really saw this as a moment to force some change, but it was built on emotion and pain and hurt. And so many people identified with Michael Brown, not because they knew Michael Brown, but they knew of Michael Brown. They knew an 18-year-old black man who was stopped by the police every single day in Missouri. They understand the disparities in the treatment from law enforcement and the courts. And to think back to that moment, there was so much anger and frustration and pain, but also so much great hope. So when I think back to those days 5 years ago, and we wonder how much has changed, and we remember those moments where the seeds were planted, and we have to question how much has changed, how much blood and sweat and tears were spilled, and for what at this point?
How much has changed, Jason?
A lot has changed, and not for the better. When I think of that, and I was there for two riots. I was tear gassed. I saw the police basically do the most abusive Simon Says game possible of telling activists go here, then go there, and then use that as an excuse to beat people down and shoot them and embrace a kind of violence that most of us didn't believe was possible in this country or to live with it on a regular basis. And I think to myself, imagine if this had happened under President Donald Trump. Imagine what would have happened to that town. He would have sent tanks, people would have died, there would have been massive arrests. So have we changed as a country? Yes, people are aware that these things happen now, but have we changed for the better? I wouldn't say yes. Not when you have a white nationalist in the White House. Not when you have a Justice Department that is snatching back consent decrees from the very communities that were engaging this kind of behavior. Not when Ferguson still has the same mayor. So, you know, I'm trying to sort of hold control of myself because it was a pretty disturbing experience, and Trymaine and I have actually had this kind of conversation before. It also marked a change in the responsibility and behavior of black journalists in this country, because these are some of the places that we would go that I think some of our white colleagues wouldn't at the time. And so we have been dealing with not just the trauma of what has happened to this country, but having to go into these places and directly live with this kind of violence on a regular basis and explain it to our colleagues. That's what I've experienced in the last 5 years.
Trymaine, are we moving backwards, as Jason says? I mean, this week alone, we saw another minority community targeted. In the wake of the shooting in El Paso, Latinos across this country are saying they're living in fear. And I'm not just talking about undocumented immigrants, I'm talking about citizens. Are we moving backwards?
I think it's twofold. Just to keep it kind of hyper-local in Ferguson, one of the big issues was with Bob McCullough, the St. Louis County prosecutor, declining to really lead the grand jury to an indictment of Darren Wilson, the police officer. Wesley Bell, an African-American, has been elected to replace him. That is change. But when you think about what Ferguson actually represents, the same way Obama's presidency ushered in this new era of hate, and people couldn't imagine that this brown-skinned man with the name Barack Obama was in the White House, that was a pivot point, because then you saw Blue Lives Matter emerge next to Black Lives Matter, a retort that really was baked into that alt-right and the racist, white supremacist right. So what I see from Ferguson 5 years on, it was really a tipping point in many ways. We had to address and confront the long history of abuses from law enforcement, but then there were the seething of resentments from Obama to Trayvon Martin to Michael Brown, and I don't think we get to where we are now without those events in Michael Brown. People will point to Ferguson and say, look at that, they're animals burning an American city, without peeling back the layers to understand the frustration and the pain and all of the hurt heaped upon folks for generation after generation. So I think in some ways there has been progress. But if the last 3 years have proven anything at all, it's that the pendulum always swings back. Whenever there is progress, especially in terms of race relations, you see the pendulum of white supremacy swing back. And I think we are seeing the seeds of that now. I think Jason is right on. But still, I do believe in talking to activists on the ground and community folks and a group of young voters in particular who are activated, engaged, and energized, and they still believe in change. The sad part is there is so much weight on those folks in Ferguson where so many activists have lost their lives. There have been a number of suicides. There have been a number of deaths, mysterious deaths in that community of people linked to the Ferguson uprising. And so while so much has changed, so much has most certainly remained the same. Stephanie.
Trymaine, thank you. Jason, we talked about this yesterday. There's been backlash this week against businessman Stephen Ross. He's the CEO of Related, a real estate giant. They own SoulCycle. They own Equinox.
Right.
He's going to be hosting a fundraiser for President Trump this weekend in the Hamptons. And we saw customers stand up and say no more. En masse, there has been a boycott. There's a tweet that stood out to me from my friend and yours, Matthew Dowd, where he writes, so let me get this straight. Many Trump supporters think it is right to boycott Nike for fighting against racism, but it is wrong to boycott companies who support racism. Do I have that right? What's your thoughts?
We talked about this before. We're finally at this important public narrative moment where you can no longer say, well, I'm down with Trump for the tax cuts and the racism is just an extra thing. It's both. It is both. If you support this president, then you're supporting his white nationalism. If you support this president, then you support caging babies at the border. If you support this president, you support sending in ICE in order to separate people from their children and leaving those kids abandoned after school.
It ain't just the Access Hollywood tape anymore.
It ain't just the Access Hollywood tape anymore. I think this is a wonderful, critical moment. I think that if you support this president, you have every right to. We're in a democracy, but you can be shamed. You can be exposed, and the public can say, I don't want to take part in what this administration is doing anymore. And I'm glad that this is happening.
I want Ashley Parker to join us again. Ashley, you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
So to me, the critical point here is this is about women. Women got out there and ran and voted and won in 2018. SoulCycle, Equinox, you know who their customer base are? Women. Is this a moment where we are seeing the sentiment, a preview of what is going to fuel the 2020 election, or is this really the story of the day because rage is all the rage and people are going to be right back on their soul bikes tomorrow when they realize their $42 class passes are going to expire soon?
Potentially. I mean, one thing is certain, that women, especially moderate, suburban, independent women, are going to be crucial in deciding this election one way or the other. But I do think it's important to separate a boycott of SoulCycle with voting in November. I mean, there's a very real world in which what you said, people realize they've paid in advance for 10 packs and classes and they don't want to lose them and they return to SoulCycle. But do they vote in November? Do they go out and do they canvass? Do they get their friends to go out and persuade their friends who maybe voted for President Trump last time but don't like the tweets, the language, the way he speaks about women, about blacks, about Hispanics? So a boycott can certainly be powerful, and I think it is a reflection of a lot of the anger and frustration and rage a number of people are feeling at this president right now. But there is then a leap to what it translates to when it comes to politics in the ballot box.
All right. Thank you all. Trymaine Lee, Jason Johnson, Ashley Parker. I want to turn back to immigration. The largest single state immigration enforcement action in the United States.